many climate migrants are there? Scientific estimates have provided a wide range of future projections of varying degrees of reliability, but what about right now? How many people are currently moving because of the impacts of climate change or are impacted by climate change as they move? We don't know precisely, and we probably will never really know for sure. But more evidence is building about the role that climate change plays in current migration, both in spurring internal and international movements, and affecting people already en route. The more we find out, the clearer it is that climate change is already playing a role in whether and how people migrate. Welcome to Changing Climate, Changing Migration, coming to you from the Migration Policy Institute. My name is Julia Neusner. On this podcast, we explore what climate change means for human movement around the world. Numbers are, for better or worse, a big part of how the public understands migration, which is to say that when we don't have estimates about the scale of a dynamic, it's hard to know how seriously to treat it. My guest today is Julia Neusner. She's a lawyer and a researcher who's been doing some great work attaching firm, empirical data to questions about climate migration, now with the International Refugee Assistance Project, also known as IRAP. A recent report she wrote presented findings from a survey of more than 3,000 migrants already in the United States or seeking to enter the country and asked about their experiences with climate impacts. Julia, thanks so much for coming on. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me.
A lot of research and analysis in this area is kind of theoretical or abstract. And one of the reasons I really wanted to have you on the podcast today is because you have this hard data from several thousand migrants about how climate and environmental impacts have affected them. What can you tell us? What are your findings?
So this we published this report called Enduring Change, a data review of firsthand accounts of climate mobility impacts in September. And it's the product of more than a year of research, as you said, with more than 3,000 survey respondents who are migrants and displaced people seeking to United States immigration relief. So we partnered with legal services organizations inside the U.S. and at the border to incorporate climate-related questions into their intake and screening procedures. And this is an ongoing project. We have recruited some new partners. We've been adjusting the questions, and we're hoping to to continue to collect data and put out some more reports. But this first report, we found that 43% of folks who answered this survey reported experiencing a climate-related disaster in their country of origin, and similarly, 43.1% experienced a climate-related disaster in transit as they were moving from their country of origin to the United States. And I think it's important to contextualize these numbers to just mention that this is a really, really limited study. It's certainly not representative of everybody who comes to the U.S. Mexico border, everybody who's on the move. We are working with a small number of organizations that serve primarily Latino migrants and displaced people, and half of the respondents are children because we're working with KIND, an organization that only serves children.
Kids in need of defense. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Kids in need of defense. And then close to 9% of respondents are Haitian because we're one of the organizations we're working with is Haitian Bridge Alliance, which serves primarily Haitian people. And the others, Las Americas Immigrant Advocacy Center and Al Otro Lado, are located at the U.S. Mexico border, and most of the folks they serve are from the Americas. So the most represented nationalities in this study are people from Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. And we actually ended up limiting the scope of the project is global, but we limited this first report to people from the Americas because the vast majority of respondents were from the Americas.
Can you talk about what kind of impacts or disasters people experienced? You said basically 43% separately or both in origin and on the route. I mean, was it hurricanes, drought?
Yeah.
A little bit of both? Everything?
Yeah. So the survey has pick list questions with some of the most common responses that we've heard. And before this study, we had asked similar questions on the ground in migrant shelters at the border. So that's where the questions came from. But the disasters that were most reported were heavy rains, extreme heat, hurricanes, and flooding in that order, close to 38 to 40 6% of folks reported experiencing one or more of those disasters. And importantly, 64% of those who reported disasters in their country of origin experienced multiple disasters.
Mm.
And then in transit, the most commonly reported challenges were extreme heat, extreme cold, and heavy rains. And then we also asked questions about the impacts of these disasters. For in countries of origin, the most commonly reported impacts from a pick list that we provided were destruction of homes. More than half of respondents
Hmm.
who experienced a disaster in their home country said their home was damaged or destroyed. 34% said essential services were disrupted. 45% said that their ability to earn a livelihood was disrupted, whether that's because of crop failure or their business was destroyed by disasters or closed. And many others. It was a pretty extensive pick list. Many others reported experiencing injury or illness or other social determinants of health because of these disasters.
So I'll be honest, and I mean, you say this is not necessarily representative sample and all that's taken into account, but I mean, these are high numbers, right? 43% is a lot. That's more than I would have expected. Was that more than you expected? I mean, was that a surprise? And did that affect or change how you think about climate as a factor in movement, especially to the U.S. Mexico border?
Yeah, I guess yes, this was surprising because and I guess I want to just backtrack to where this project came from, or some work that I did previous to this project that kind of set the foundation. I was previously working with an organization called Human Rights First, focused on border and asylum access. So I did, without the climate component. So I did hundreds of interviews at the U.S. Mexico border about the impact of U.S. policies on mostly on asylum seekers, and I asked people why they fled their homes, and nobody mentioned climate. Almost nobody. It was very, very rare that somebody would mention climate, but in a few, I had a few opportunities to ask kind of more targeted questions, and I found a lot of these people who are at least from some Central America and Mexico who are coming to the border are poor. Many of them are from agriculture areas, and these are regions that have just been hit really hard by extreme heat and by hurricanes and by disasters that are increasing in frequency and intensity. So I wanted to kind of explore those connections more. So I partnered with IRAP, the U.S. Committee for Immigrants and Refugees, USCRI, and Stanford Law School at the beginning of last year to do an on-the-ground study where we just asked more targeted questions about how climate impacted people. And because I hadn't heard people mention climate that much before, I was worried that we wouldn't come up with anything. And I kind of had a backup plan where we would talk about, climate impacts in transit, because I know that
Hmm.
that is something people are experiencing. So, but we were shocked to find that when, we did these interviews in these shelters in Tijuana, and almost everybody we spoke to, they gave a reason unrelated to climate for why they left, most frequently because they experienced threats of violence or had experienced violence by organized criminal groups, gangs, and cartels in their area. But it was often domestic violence, political persecution, a host of reasons. But as we asked more questions, like, you were in Guatemala in 2020. How did Hurricanes Eta and Iota affect you? We would find that these disasters often set the conditions to their vulnerabilities, and in many cases were the catalyst that gave rise to persecution by the gangs. So a
Mm.
lot of people told us, like, oh yeah, the hurricane totally destroyed our crops or destroyed our business. The cartels kept on demanding extortion payments. They destroyed infrastructure, and the cartels came in and provided the resources we needed because the government wasn't doing anything. But then they used that opportunity to recruit people, and then they started threatening us. We had to leave, and we just heard stories like that again and again. So I guess by we this IRAP study is a significant expansion of that initial on the ground report we did, and it was so I guess after having it, so it was pretty consistent with those findings that that climate has impacted people in these different ways that that may have impacted their decisions to leave.
I'm very interested in that causality, which I mean, as you kind of suggest, there is very tricky to disentangle for individuals themselves, much less for kind of third party observers. But to the extent you can kind of disentangle, I'm curious at your ability to disentangle that. I mean, you mentioned what, like half of people who experience disasters, those disasters destroyed or damaged their home. That seems like a somewhat direct manifestation of like I had a house, the hurricane come, now I don't have a house, I have to leave. Whereas other times, when storms or drought impacts farmlands, there can be a more economic or livelihood connection that then drives ultimately people to leave. Can you? I mean, did you have any sense of that kind of direct versus indirect causality? It seems like most of the connections were indirect, right?
Yeah, so our survey actually did not ask questions about causality, just because of length
Sure.
limitations. We have this embedded in a larger intake process that these organizations are undertaking, where they'll ask more detailed questions about reasons for leaving. But I think the main takeaway from so we cannot make any definitive conclusions about whether about we can't call these survey respondents climate displaced, because we don't know. We know
Sure.
that they are displaced or choosing to move. We know that much. And we know that they those who answered affirmatively to these questions experienced climate disasters before they left. But I think the major takeaway from this report is that, well, that these people on the move experienced disasters, and that those disasters worsened existing vulnerabilities. Because, as you said, a very high number of people reported their houses destroyed. Many reported health impacts. Many
Hmm.
reported increase in violent conflict. And I did have the opportunity to speak with some of these respondents on the phone.
Mm.
And when I was able to kind of ask these follow-up questions, like I described doing in Tijuana, that's when I could kind of identify a climate connection just anecdotally. I spoke to one man from El Salvador who was a fisherman, and after heavy rains and flooding, the government issued a red alert and forbade people from fishing,
Mm.
and he was unable to make a living. The government didn't provide any support to the community. Cartel moved in and did provide support, and then used that opportunity to recruit people, unable to support themselves, and then he had to flee because they tried to recruit him and he resisted.
Mm.
So, and I spoke to another woman who said that droughts, they hadn't had a tomato crop in years in Mexico due to droughts. Cartels continued to extort community members, and then actually started controlling the flow of farming supplies and like access to natural resources that they needed for their crops, and taking advantage of these challenging climate conditions. And ultimately she had to flee because they could no longer she could no longer feed her family under those conditions. So I think it's really hard to tease out causality really for anybody who chooses to move. There, it's a confluence of
Yeah.
reasons. Even if somebody's house is destroyed, people don't want to leave their community. They don't want to leave their home. They
Sure.
can rebuild. They will go stay with family. It's rare that I've heard people say my house was destroyed and therefore I'm coming to the United States. It's these things build, and it's often these threats of immediate violence that are the final straw that drive people to leave. But there's so many factors that go into it.
So I'm really interested in that notion of gang violence, of violent conflict, threats of immediate violence, as you just said, which is not a thing that we've talked about a lot on this podcast, but I think is a very important dynamic. And one of the reasons I'm particularly interested in that is because, as we know, as you know, generally speaking, there are no legal protections for people fleeing impacts of climate change or for people displaced by the impacts of climate change. But there are often can be protections for people facing persecution, including sometimes from gangs. You're a lawyer, right? I guess so. Is it possible that there are likely some number of people who have fled the impacts of climate change who, in fact, are already receiving protection or eligible for protection in the US and other countries, not because of the climate change per se, but because climate change kind of triggered a series of events that elevated gang power or violent groups that then forced them to flee? Does that chain of connections
Yeah,
make
yeah,
sense?
totally. So they, as you said, like humanitarian pathways to safety are quite limited, but we do have the asylum and refugee system in the United States. They're where the standard is similar for those forms of protection. They protect people fleeing persecution by governments or entities the government is unable and unwilling to control for quite narrow reasons. On account of a protected ground like race, religion, political opinion, particular social group. Uh, so, so like you said, a climate displaced person who is fleeing, for example, because a disaster destroyed their home would not because of those circumstances alone qualify under those criteria. But there are many asylum seekers and refugees who do qualify for protection because climate impacts intersect with like other forms of persecution and other drivers of displacement. So I think the examples I gave about gang violence in relation, being exacerbated in the context of climate related disasters are not very strong cases. The
Mm,
case law on gang violence is in flux. There needs to like persecution by gangs alone is not a criteria. Even if the government's unable and unwilling to protect, it's not. It's all unless it needs to be because of a protected ground. So
mhm.
there are certainly examples where that's the case, and we've been doing a lot of work at IRAP on trying to identify fact patterns where climate impacted folks would be eligible for relief. One common example is indigenous groups who face
Mm.
historic marginalization and discrimination in their countries of origin, who then are displaced from their land because of climate disasters or resource scarcity, and like lack of access of land ability incentivizes governments or private actors to forcibly take their land. And then in that case, there's ethnicity is a protected ground, and if the government is unable to, or complicit in perpetrating this persecution, they can be eligible for relief. And there have been a number of successful asylum cases with fact patterns like that.
Hmm.
So yes, there are situations where refugee and asylum law will protect these people, but the vast majority likely are people impacted by climate change and who are displaced do not fit that narrow criteria.
What about climate disasters, environmental impacts experienced en route? I mean, what kind of dynamics did people say they experienced? What were the ramifications of those experiences?
Sure, yeah. So people who are coming to the U.S. Mexico border, who don't have a legal, who don't have a visa or you don't have some kind of legal pathway to arrive, have to take increasingly perilous journeys that are made. The more access to borders is restricted, the more dangerous these journeys become. So, as I said, 43% encountered environmental challenges during transit. The most commonly reported were extreme heat, extreme cold, and heavy rains. And then our survey also asked about, for those who said they experienced extreme weather events like these, other environmental challenges that may would have likely been made worse by extreme weather. So 53% said they traveled on foot through rivers, 46% through deserts, 43% through mountainous terrain, 28% slept outside or in encampments due to lack of shelter. Um, so these already dangerous journeys, under the best of conditions, and are deadly. Go many, and then as temperature fluctuations become more extreme, hurricanes and other extreme weather are more frequent. They become even more deadly.
I mean, I think statistically, the U.S. Like ground route into the U.S. Over land is considered like the deadliest migration route in the world, right? So this is because of the large
That's
deserts, the
accurate. Yeah.
yeah. Um, So, which it sounds like you're saying that situation's only exacerbated because of the climate on the one hand, and then people are pushed into more hazardous areas because of enforcement policies and stiffer barriers to entry. Did that Do people express regret about experiencing those? I mean, are there people who migrated, then like wished they had not migrated because of those environmental challenges? And I guess if so, is there a universe or is there a framework of understanding in which vulnerability to climate disasters or climate impacts en route is itself a deterrent to irregular migration?
I so I have heard sometimes in interviews and a little bit, in the open text response on this survey, people expressing regret for having undertaken the journey, especially people who undertake it with children, who
Mm.
say, I told my family and friends back home not to do it. It's too dangerous. But I hear that rarely, actually, and
Hmm.
we people have described absolutely horrific journeys, but they leave home for a reason, and it's no secret that these journeys are deadly. I mean, the dairy and I actually spent some time earlier this year doing research in the Darien Gap jungle in
Mhm.
Panama, which is like a strip of jungle connecting Colombia with Panama that is notoriously dangerous because of the environmental conditions, landslides, floods. It's just like physically grueling to get through it, but also like rampant abuse by organized criminal groups inside those jungles that extort people, kill people, attack people, and these hazards are known. And as more restrictive policies have been enacted, the number of people crossing through that jungle has just increased exponentially. So 500,000 people crossed through that jungle last year. The year before that, it was 250,000. It's just significantly higher than any of the averages in previous years. And those increases can be linked directly to more the implementation of more restrictive policies like visa requirements on air travel to Mexico, which is all to say that these policies that are enacted with the intention of deterring migration, that make it more difficult or unpleasant to migrate. I mean, that's the rationale behind increasing enforcement near cities in the United States in the 90s. It doesn't work. Deterrence does not work. People are, whatever like urgent threats that people are facing at home, that compel them to leave, is stronger than the danger they're going to face along the way. So I think like that's a reality that governments need to acknowledge and accept, and instead of trying to make these, instead of trying to up the ante with deterrence, like we need humanitarian interventions that acknowledge that people are going to be on the move and that they need protection.
That's basically all we have time for today, unfortunately. But this was a really good conversation. That's a stirring note to end on. Julia, thank you so much for your time. This has been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks so much for having me.
Julia Neusner is a climate research and operations specialist at the International Refugee Assistance Project. Her recent report, featuring the survey that we talked about here, is called Enduring Change, a data review of first-hand accounts of climate mobility impacts. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Changing Climate, Changing Migration. Make sure you're subscribed to the podcast so you can catch all of our new episodes as soon as they come out. You can find us on all the major podcast platforms. Think you might have missed an episode? Scroll through the archives on our website at migrationpolicy.org/podcasts. While you're there, explore our special collection of analysis about climate migration from our Migration Information Source magazine. That's at migrationpolicy.org/climate. Also, twice a month, we send out our free Migration Information Source newsletter with analysis, data, and insights about cutting-edge issues in international migration. Subscribe through our site at migrationinformation.org. This episode of Changing Climate, Changing Migration was produced by Daniela Espastro. Editorial oversight came from Michelle Middlestat, and additional assistance was provided by Lisa Dixon. Our theme music is Touch by Patrick Petrukios. Once again, I'm Julian Haddam. Thank you for listening.